Do you believe that Slate magazine, known for its controversial stands, has just indefinitely fired a podcaster for having a debate with a colleague on a messaging platform interoffice as to whether and when it is ever appropriate for a white person to use the N-word in discussing racial issues? Fired for having a debate and a discussion, and told that it's not proper for white people even to debate this issue. You're going to hear why that's just wrong on the Dershow. Censorship regarding matters of race is becoming worse and worse and worse. Yesterday we discussed two adjunct professors who were fired from a very distinguished, very top law school, Georgetown Law School, for having a discussion on Zoom, a private discussion regarding grades and African Americans, and bemoaning the fact that African Americans don't do as well as white counterparts in grading. They were fired. One was actually fired, the other was pressured to resign because of a discussion about the issue and an admission by the teacher that she felt terrible about it, that it drove her crazy and that she had all kinds of difficulties and she maybe hoped we can do better. And she got fired. Well, today the news comes out, a New York Times report, that Slate magazine, which is known for covering controversial issues in controversial ways, has now indefinitely suspended, a euphemism for fired, indefinitely suspended one of its major podcasters for debating with colleagues over whether people who are not black should be able to quote a racial slur in some contexts. I don't know the guy. His name is Mike Pesca, and he's host of The Gist, a podcast on news and culture. And he was suspended indefinitely because he was in a debate in an interoffice messaging platform, not even a public debate, but within the Slate office. There was a discussion about whether it's ever appropriate for a white person to use the N-word in discussing race or discussing whether the N-word should be used. There's no indication in the Times story that he actually used the N-word. The indication, maybe that's wrong, is that he said, quote, N-word. He didn't use the actual slur, even in his conversation with his colleague. And now that's enough to get you fired, to get you indefinitely suspended. I wonder what they did to the guy who was listening. Did he get called out for bystander failure to correct it? What's going on? You can't even debate this issue now. In fact, the head of Slate, according to the New York Times, was listening to this exchange, and it says Slate's chief executive, Dan Check, stepped in and shut down the discussion. Oh, no. You cannot discuss whether to discuss the N-word. Can you discuss whether to discuss the N-word? Is this podcast today a grounds for firing? Is YouTube going to take me down because I'm discussing whether it's appropriate to discuss whether it's okay to use the N-word in conversations about whether or not this word should ever be used in any context? Remember, my colleague Randy Kennedy wrote a whole book, and the cover of the book is the N-word. I don't use the N-word ever, so I'm not going to use it on this show. But go online and Amazon, put in the N-word, Randy Kennedy, and you'll see the name of the book is the N-word, and it's sold lots of copies, and it's a brilliant book, and it's had major impact. Now, there's a difference, of course, in the minds of Slate and in the minds of Georgetown Law School. Randy Kennedy happens to be African American, so he gets a license to use the N-word, not only to use it, but to put it on the cover of a book. And people reading the book won't necessarily immediately know, certainly people seeing the cover of the book won't immediately know who the author is and whether the author is white or black. But the question is, can only African Americans debate this issue? A number of the people from Slate were opposed to this firing. The former head of Slate says, I don't think he did anything that merits discipline or consequences. And I think it's an example of the kind of overreaction and a lack of judgment and perspective that is unfortunately spreading. But an African American staff member of Slate said no. He said, quote, for black employees, it's an extremely small ask not to hear that particular slur and, listen to this, and not to have debate about whether it's okay for white employees to use that particular slur. In other words, an African-American staff member is saying you cannot debate the issue if you're white. If you're black, you can debate the issue. What if one person is black and one person is white? Can you have a discussion with a black colleague and can he use the N-word but you can't? Or forget about using the N-word. Again, I don't know that there's any evidence that the N-word was used during this conversation at all. Can you even have that debate and have that discussion? I mean, this is real censorship. When you can't debate issues, when there's only one answer, where is our freedom of speech? Where is our academic freedom when it comes to Georgetown University? When the result is you have to profusely apologize for doing nothing wrong, we're really in deep trouble. Now, again, as I did yesterday, I want to contrast that with what went on at the Grammys the other night. One of the entertainers, she didn't win a Grammy, so there was no excuse or reason for having to select her to present, but she was hired or asked by the Grammy people, I don't know if they pay the performers, to perform. And this is a woman who has made blatantly anti-Semitic statements. She talks about white Jews upholding white supremacy. That's not anti-Zionism. That's anti-Semitism. She's also an anti-Zionist. She says Israel shouldn't exist. Israel is a barbaric, and you name it. She's used every term. And of course, who is her hero? Her hero is the most prominent anti-Semite in America today, the Reverend Farrakhan. She thinks he's GOAT, greatest of all time. She has praised him, admired him, gone to his lectures, applauded his virulently anti-Semitic statements where he calls Jewishness what does he call them, a garbage religion or a sewer religion. And he talks about how Jews were the major people responsible for the slave trade. It's just total nonsense, complete nonsense. But this woman, Mallory, is a big admirer of Farrakhan, and she herself has made these statements. In fact, she was kicked off the Women's March for anti-Semitic statements. But for the Grammys, hey, that's okay, because black artists have a license not only to use the N-word, we know that, but black artists apparently, according to the Grammys, have a license to attack Jews as well. Okay, one can understand the argument that there is a double standard for the use of the N-word. Yeah, blacks can use it, whites can't use it. Double standard for the use of the N-word. I understand that. But double standard for anti-Semitism? No. There's no excuse for that. Just because you're a black artist doesn't mean you should get a pass and get a license to attack Jews and to attack Israel and to attack the nation state of the Jewish people and single it out uniquely for condemnation. I'm not talking about criticizing Israel's policies. I'm talking about virulently anti-Semitic statements. And Mallory is a virulent anti-Semite, and she is praised and invited and licensed by the Grammys at the same time when white professors and columnists are fired because they want to have a discussion, a serious intellectual discussion about an important issue That affects their teaching in the case of Georgetown, and that affects their podcasting in the case of Slate. Where does this stop? Where is it going? What can we discuss? What can't we discuss? Can we have serious conversations about race anymore? I have to tell you, if I was still teaching at Harvard after 50 years, I don't know that I'd want to have conversations about race. I don't know that I'd want to sit at a lunch table and listen to professors bemoan the fact that African American students don't seem to be doing as well as their white counterparts, and trying to explore the reasons why. When I first came to Harvard, I was asked to teach a course on legal writing. I'm a very good writer. A class on legal writing to students who are having trouble with their writing. And a large number of the students in the class were African American students who were brilliant, really, really smart as could be, but hadn't mastered the art of legal writing. And so we went out of our way to offer an opportunity to all students, and many of them who took advantage of it were African Americans, to bolster their ability to compete in the difficult marketplace of Harvard Law School. In the course of doing that, we had discussions, clearly honest, difficult discussions about race and about why we needed to have special class or remedial class, open to everybody to be sure, but primarily focused on minority students. We had very, very difficult discussions about race-specific affirmative action. Why do you need to have race-specific affirmative action? And people expressed honest views about that. And some of those views today would be fireable offenses. You're not allowed to believe certain things in universities today. Yeah, I guess if you believe them and don't tell anybody about your belief, you can get away with it. Nobody is yet asking for lie detector tests or loyalty oaths, although the University of Chicago Literature Department came very close to demanding a loyalty oath. But if you dare to express your views in a private conversation with a colleague, in a Zoom call, which you assumed was just between you and a colleague, in an inter-company conversation like on Slate magazine, you're out of there. You're out of there. You're fired. What effect this is having on academic freedom and freedom of speech? People are simply being chilled, frozen into silence. That's not the way academia should work. That's not the way Slate magazine should work. That's not the way this podcast is ever going to work. We're going to discuss these issues. And if you don't like it, call the politically correct cops on me. I'm not going to apologize, and I'm not going to stop doing it. These are subjects that require discussion, and I welcome your calls. Call me and tell me, do not use the N-word. That I do forbid. I don't want to use that word. It's not necessary. We don't have to use it on this show. But call me and tell me whether you think it's appropriate to use the N-word in certain conversations. If I thought it was necessary, I would think hard about it. In one case involving the New School, a teacher who has a black child used the N-word quoting a great black writer, Baldwin, in one of his books, and had a discussion about Baldwin's use of the N-word, and she got called in and investigated. I don't know what the end result of the the New School investigation was. If any of you do, maybe you can let me know. I tried to check it out online. I couldn't find it. But I could find that she was investigated and that she was suspended, and we don't know what the end result was, whether she was hired back, allowed to teach, for quoting Baldwin, one of the great black writers. I have to tell you, today, literature professors aren't going to teach Baldwin. They're not going to teach black writers. Of course, they'll get condemned for that as well. But if they do, and if they teach writers who use the N-word, Mark Twain, a white writer who used the N-word. He created fantastic characters, including some who were African Americans, and the N-word was used because it was used in those days. We can't go back and re-edit books that were written a long time ago. I guess you can leave out the last letters of the N-word when you publish Mark Twain's book if you feel that's necessary. I have to tell you, as a Jew, I would not feel it was necessary if you're quoting people who have said nasty things about Jews, and that's part of the literature class. Dostoevsky said horrible, horrible things about Jews. He was a virulent anti-Semite, as was Charles Dickens. Should we eliminate Fagin as a character in his book because Fagin is so stereotyped? What do we do with Shylock in The Merchant of Venice? Where does it stop? Why? Why don't we think people have sufficient thick-skinned intellectual determination and curiosity to deal with these issues in a serious way? Remember, none of us is talking about a teacher pointing to a black student and using the N-word, or a teacher pointing to a Jewish student and using the K-word, or a teacher pointing to a female student and using some insulting slur. We're not talking about that. Even in the case of Myers-Leonard, where he used the word kike, and yeah, I'm using the word kike because it was part of the discussion. He wasn't calling anybody a kike. He wasn't calling a Jewish woman a kike, B-I, word. He was just throwing it out, and that was wrong. He had no excuse, no justification for that, and he got fined and he got suspended proportionately, basically, to his sin. Maybe it should have been a little bit more of a fine, because $50,000 on a $10 million salary is not much of a fine. But that's different. That's different. He had no intellectual reason, no academic reason, no publishing reason, no podcast reason for throwing out those words. He was just doing it as a kid, and throwing out bigoted words. But the cases I'm talking about, having a serious discussion with colleagues about it. In fact, Slate had a rule. I'm trying to see if I can find the rule. Slate had a rule, quote, in November 2019, Slate introduced a policy that required podcast hosts and producers to discuss the use of racist terms in a pending episode in or out of quoted material before recording it. So in other words, Slate itself had a policy saying you have to discuss it. So the people discussed it, and they got fired for following the policy and discussing it. So the worst thing is there are not going to be any lawsuits about this. Why? Because Georgetown University is a private university. Slate is a private First Amendment protected entity. So there probably won't be any lawsuits. What there is instead are apologies, mea culpas. Oh, I'm so terribly sorry. I'll never do it again. I shouldn't have done it. I did such a terrible, terrible thing. Reminds me of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. I was there in China at the end of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. My son and I went to China in 1979, 1980 over the Christmas break. And we met with people, lawyers and academics who had been subject to the Cultural Revolution. They were sent to camps where they had to be taught and re-educated and given moral lessons as to what was wrong with what they said and what they thought. And now they've been rehabilitated. They can come back to society and never again repeat their intellectual sins. That was the Cultural Revolution in China. That's what happened in the gulags in the Soviet Union. And now it's happening at Slate magazine. No, there are no gulags. No, the professors were not sent to moral rehabilitation centers by Georgetown University, but they were fired. And that sends a terrible, chilling message to professors, to bloggers, to people who have podcasts. That's not the way America should be. That's not what the framers contemplated when they wrote the First Amendment. That's not what Americans want. We want full and robust, sensitive discussion, sensitive to be sure, non-accusatory, but none of these were accusatory. They were sensitive, thoughtful, deeply felt, honestly believed discussions. And for that, they get fired. I want to know what you think about that. I want to know if you have instances in your experience where you've heard of similar things. We're going to fight this on the Dershow. We're going to fight it tooth and nail because this is not the America I love. Now for the wits on the Dershow. Our callers, first call.
Yeah, hi, this is Kent from Minnesota. Big fan of your show. Just responding back to that Georgetown professor that got fired because she voiced her opinion. My opinion is this stuff has gone on too long, and somebody needs to stand up to this. And I would hope that the professor would sue the college for wrongful termination. And it would be nice if you would represent her, I think, and see if something can be done. And if the college is found in the wrong, that, I don't know, she'd get a settlement or whatever. But I think the best thing in these things would be to have the party that gets charged would have to do a public, on-camera apology to that person or whatever, and then correct themselves for terminating them. Just wondering your thoughts. Thank you.
Great call. I would, of course, be honored to represent her if she decided to bring a lawsuit against Georgetown Law School. It's going to be a tough lawsuit because Georgetown is a private university. It does receive federal funding, obviously. It is a religiously based institution, which maybe gives it a little bit more authority, but you'd have to look at the handbook and the contracts to see whether there was a cause of action. There have been successful lawsuits against private universities, some in Massachusetts. Massachusetts does have a special law that makes some large institutions subject to some restrictions. But the problem is universities, private universities, also have their own First Amendment rights. And so whether they include the right to fire somebody for wanting to express heartfelt views is a different question. I would hope the American Association of University Professors and FIRE and other organizations would become involved in this and at least formally protest what Georgetown Law School did. What Georgetown Law School did is dead wrong. I invite the Dean of Georgetown Law School to come on this podcast and defend his actions. I invite anybody from Georgetown Law School who believes and supports the actions of Georgetown to come on this show. Let's debate it in the marketplace of ideas.
Professor Dershowitz, my name's Becky from Washington State. I love your show, and I have a question for you. It seems state legislatures are passing or proposing laws to make harassment of threats of elected officials or criminal justice participants of a felony. These new bills are attempting to place stronger weight to words equivalent to action when relayed verbally or electronically. It seems the elected officials can simply feel threatened or say they are suffering from words. Under this change of reality, if I were to tweet, I would like to punch my state rep, then later attend a public meeting saying it to their face, my state rep could have me arrested. Or even a protester could say to a police officer, I'm going to kill you, and then later tweet, police officers need to die. When the two are present again, the protester could be arrested. So if words now mean action taken place, and now elected officials can't feel threatened, how does this help our First Amendment rights and our republic? How can we challenge this? Love this forum you've done and created for us to have constructive criticism, constructive discussion. I look forward to how this is answered.
It's a great question, a very difficult question, right at the cutting edge of the First Amendment. There is a concept called fighting words. I don't think it still exists as an exception to the First Amendment, but threats, specific threats, are not covered by the First Amendment. We know that threatening the president is a crime, and people have been arrested and successfully prosecuted for specific threats against the president. But if you put on a website or a tweet, I think so-and-so should die, that's not a direct threat. It's an interesting case in Israel some years ago where a rabbi issued a curse against the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin just weeks before he was murdered in cold blood by somebody who disagreed with his policies. And the rabbi called for him to die, but he called for him to die at the hands of God, not at the hands of an individual. He was prosecuted for inciting or threatening, and my recollection is the appellate courts reversed the conviction and said that cursing somebody, asking for God to kill him, is different than inciting human beings to kill him. It's a very hard question where the line is to be drawn. I get threats all the time. I get threats to myself. I get threats to my family. I get threats, immediate threats, general threats. A lot of people want me to die. A lot of people think I am dying. They think I have Alzheimer's because I defended President Trump in the Senate, so therefore I must be losing my mind. You know, when you're in the public sphere, you have to get used to these kinds of attacks, but specific threats are very different. And the courts have to sort that out. There's no simple answer except to say the First Amendment always errs on the side of protecting speech.
This is Andrew calling from Connecticut. My 3 children are doing exceptionally well academically, and they can go anywhere they want to go, pretty much, with the kind of report cards they go. But I've got great hesitation about all this indoctrination stuff that's going on in higher education. So what's the solution? Send them to the Coast Guard Academy where maybe there's less of that? I don't know. So I've got no objection to sending my children to a school where they're the only one in the room saying the emperor has no clothes, and they're ostracized, they have no friends, but they still graduate. But nowadays, if you're in the classroom, you're the only one who says the emperor has no clothes, you're going to be ostracized, you're going to have no friends, but they're also going to expel you and keep the tuition payment, and then you're going to be blacklisted and no one will touch you. So what's the answer?
It's a great question. I get this question all the time from friends who are considering sending their children to schools, and they call me or they write to me, sometimes strangers as well. They say, my kid got into Berkeley or San Francisco State, and I see all this horrible anti-Semitism being promoted and tolerated, and I see other kinds of anti-white attitudes being taught. What do I do? It's very hard. I think it very much depends on your child. If your child is somebody who loves a good fight, who can really fight back, I think they'll do well at schools. Now, I'm not sure I'd pick San Francisco State or maybe Berkeley, but you know, schools like Harvard and Princeton and Chicago and many other schools, Virginia, Vanderbilt, Duke. I'm talking about the really, really great schools. You'll find that the students will feel a little left out, and there'll be some criticism, but they won't be expelled as long as they follow the rules of the university. If they go to a public school, they are even more protected by the First Amendment. But if they go to a private school, they're likely to do fine. But it depends. If the student himself, he or she really doesn't like controversy, then I would probably try to pick a school that would be less controversial. I think in most schools you can pretty much stay out of that if you decide to just keep a low profile. And it depends on what courses you take. If you take a course on race in a major university, you darn well better express views that are politically correct. Otherwise, you will get in trouble. But, you know, stay away from those courses. Stay away from courses that are ideologically bent. And there are too many of them in universities anyway. Universities should not be teaching you what to think. They should be teaching you how to think. And so if you're taking science courses, if you're taking courses in subjects that are non-ideological, then I think it's easier to survive. But what's not ideological today? Literature, ideological. Linguistics, ideological. Political science, ideological. History, ideological. Maybe physics is not ideological. Geology, who knows? So everything is divisive and ideological today. But I think you can make thoughtful decisions in making recommendations about your child. But it depends exactly on who your child is, and it will differ enormously depending on the nature of the student.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. This is Howard from Maryland. I hope that there's a nationwide call for voter integrity, especially considering that the Iowa representative who won the seat, or the Republican who won the seat by 6 votes, is now her election is being overturned by Nancy Pelosi. I find that very interesting that they would want to do that, considering that they don't want to investigate at all if there was any funny business that went on in the presidential election of 2020. I don't know if there was funny business, but I would love to find out, which no one has bothered to do.
That's a great question. It's a great point. That's why I have pushed right from the beginning, literally right after the election, for a voter integrity panel consisting of former justices, judges, scientists, eminent people, nonpartisan, who could look into both local elections, congressional elections, senatorial, gubernatorial, and presidential, and assure the public about what the truth is. We just don't know what the truth is. I have to tell you, I have to make disclosure here. I just agreed the other day to help Mike Lindell, my pillow guy, to help his legal team. I'm just an advisor to his legal team on First Amendment issues. He's being sued for lots of money, and his company is being sued for putting out a videotape of his views on the election. His views are not necessarily my views, but that's not the criteria that I employ when I decide to take a case on the First Amendment. Under the First Amendment, you have the right to express your views. You have the right to be wrong. And the answer to wrong speech is right speech. Dominion, who's suing him, the company that made the computers that count the votes, they have full access to the marketplace of ideas. They have the right to answer, and they have, and they've in fact gotten several companies to stop buying his pillows. And so the First Amendment really involves the open marketplace of ideas. And so I'm always happy to defend anybody, whether I agree with them or not. When I was 15 and 16 and 20, I was defending the rights of communists to speak. I hated communism with a passion. In the 1970s, I was defending the right of Nazis to march through Skokie. In the 1980s, I defended a neo-Nazi who was saying terrible things about Jews, things I fundamentally disagreed with, but they denied him the right to be a member of the bar, and I thought that was wrong. So I'm going to always be on the side of the First Amendment without regard to partisanship, without regard to who is being attacked, without regard to whether the opinions expressed are true and false. Justice Rehnquist wrote a very important decision saying the First Amendment recognizes no truth or falsity when it comes to opinions. There's no such thing as a false opinion. Under the First Amendment, you're entitled to believe that the earth is flat. You'd be an idiot to do so. You're entitled to believe that the Holocaust didn't occur. You'd be an even greater idiot and bigot to believe that. But the First Amendment, unlike the rules in other countries in the world, don't make distinctions. They don't put the government in charge of determining which opinions are true and which opinions are false. And I think that is a very important part of our First Amendment.
Hi, Professor. This is John from Largo, Florida. In regard to the Chauvin case, would the demonstration of the actual hold that was put on George Floyd be admissible in court for an in-court demonstration? My reason for asking is because since it's a commonly used technique to restrain a suspect, I actually simulated it with my wife the other day, and it appears in no way did it affect my breathing. Would it be admissible in court to have an actual demonstration to show the jurors whether or not it is something that would restrict your breathing? And that's about it. Thanks, and have a great day. Great show.
That's a great question. The answer is almost certainly yes. You can use demonstrative evidence. Don't do it at home. Don't try it on your wives or children. Please, if there's any risk, don't. But if experts do it in a courtroom, it would be admissible. While you're asking about that, an update on the show we did about that. The city of Minneapolis has settled the case with the family of George Floyd for a very, very large sum, one of the largest sums ever paid, in a settlement of a police brutality case. And of course, everybody in Minneapolis knows about that. They've read it in the papers. It's been the headlines. And so the judge in the case has now said he has to consider whether or not to postpone the trial. And I think he should consider whether or not to change the venue. The trial should not be held in Minneapolis or in any large city. It should be held in a rural area. And it should consist of 14 jurors. You need 2 alternates. 14 jurors who do not know about the settlement. And that's not going to be easy to find because the settlement sounds like an admission of guilt. Now, of course, if you're the defense attorney, you might want to use the settlement to your advantage, making the argument that it was the city of Minneapolis that settled the case. That seems to suggest that what happened was part of the policy of the city of Minneapolis, that if it were just something that a rogue policeman did, maybe they'd be more reluctant to give taxpayers money to the victim of this. So the settlement literally is a knife that cuts both ways, but I think it generally hurts the defendant, and I think the judge understands that, and I think this judge seems to want to have a fair trial. It's going to be a daunting task to have a fair trial, but let's hope it occurs. Fair trials are so essential in the United States at all times, but particularly when you have divisive issues like this, where the public is clamoring for a particular result, which may or may not be justified by the evidence and the law. Well, thank you for great questions. Again, this was like a Harvard seminar. The questions are so good, so thoughtful. Please keep them coming. Tell your friends about the Dershow. Subscribe on Rumble, YouTube, any of the platforms. Keep listening, and most important, keep sending in great questions, because I want to answer them all on the Dershow. An important part of the Dershow is your voice, your questions, your comments. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050. Hard questions, criticisms, everything's fine. Just keep your questions short, and I'll answer them all on the Dershow.